Hello, BookTube. Well, as you can see, I have a guest. This is Hannah from Hannah's Books. Uh, and we are doing a feature that we did months and months and months ago that a lot of you really liked. I've got a lot of emails about this, where Hannah is a book reviewer, among also a scholar, a researcher, a beloved booktuber. She's also a book reviewer, and I'm a book reviewer. So we did a feature a while ago where we both read and then went at in a video the New York Times book review, the pull-out book section from the Sunday New York Times that, for good or ill, is the highest profile commercial book review, I would argue, anywhere in the world. It can make a reputation for a reviewer and for a book under review. So, and since we're both dyed-in-the-wool card-carrying bookworms, we go straight to the book review. I got to know, before we get to the issue, I got to know a little bit of Hannah Arcana. Are you one of the Sunday New York Times book review people that reads the book review first?
Yes.
You
Often
are.
it's the often it's the only thing I read in the paper. If it's a busy day, I pick out I share a subscription with a neighbor. And he mostly reads the New York Times online, and I mostly read his paper version. But sometimes when I'm busy or he gets it to me late in the day or anything like that, I often just read the book review.
Only the book review. Good Lord.
Sometimes.
I don't know which of us counts as a heretic. I actually don't know. I'm about at 50-50 for the people I've asked this to in my lifetime. I'm the other end of the heresy spectrum. I read it last. I
Oh,
save it
really?
last.
Interesting.
I read the Sunday New York Times from front to back.
Oh,
I arrange all of the sections. I tuck the book review in last and just read that. I don't
well, years ago, my family used to subscribe, and we would sit around the kitchen table. We'd make waffles or whatever, and split up the paper, and I always got the book review. It was the one thing that the others didn't care as much about, and that they would let me read first.
When my family sat around the kitchen table, we made lifelong enmities. We didn't make waffles.
Mhm. Well,
The
now
waffles
we
would have been made of potatoes anyway.
now when Abe's home, we fight over who gets to read the book review first. So.
So what did you make in general terms? We'll get into specifics. What did you make of this book review?
I enjoyed it. There was one issue maybe a month ago that was all about guns and weird stuff. Did you read that issue? I'm sure you did, but
Yeah. Yeah, I always
and
think
I
that it's
was
a
kind
big
of
mistake.
relieved that this did not have that.
No, you understand where such issues come from. It's some editor somewhere saying, look, we shouldn't be this fantasy land. We should occasionally ground ourselves in the real world.
Yeah,
When I don't think there's a single book reader in the world who goes to the book review not wanting it to be an escape.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
the last place you want to find it. Harsh books, yes, but not a theme of harsh.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, having one book about politics or one book about guns or whatever is one thing, but when it's just over and I mean that issue was just full of, and it was
So, did
like,
you keep any stats for this issue? Did you jot
um,
any of your
I
own stats?
did jot some down.
So did I.
Say it again.
So did I.
Oh, good. Why don't you start?
Mine will be more annoying than yours. This my devil hat was well chosen, but I guess it's not a surprise, right? All of BookTube knows that you're the nice one. And also, for those of you who are finding this video 10 or 20 years in the future, she's also the serious one, the deep one. So our stats will be different. But I did jot down some stats that may be of interest. Uh, there were, let's see here, of the 17 titles that had credits for the reviewer, 13 were written by women and 4 were written by men. And if you swap those stats, the New York Times would be put out of business, and the homes of every single editor would be firebombed. So I guess that's a progress of a kind.
Yeah, those are not the numbers that I came up with. Maybe we're looking at different books. I was looking at reviews, single reviews of full books.
Oh, well, I don't know if single reviews. I looked at the table of contents, and
Hmm.
whatever was followed by the words reviewed by. So I didn't look at
Yes.
roundups or
So
anything.
if you don't look at the audiobook section or roundups,
Well, the
yeah, it
audiobooks
looks.
had reviewed by. I just looked for those words, reviewed by.
Mhm.
And if they
Well,
weren't there, if it was an essay or if it was a roundup that wasn't credited, then I left that out. Uh,
if you look at the individual reviews of specific books, there were um, 6 books by men and 5 books by women. And then there were 4 male reviewers and 7 female reviewers. And the thing that I found really interesting that I was going to use as my stat was that the books written by men, half were reviewed by men and half were reviewed by women, which is not surprising. But women's books weren't reviewed by men. Actually, I think there's one, but that all of the women's books were reviewed by women. And I'm curious, there's some other situations in the paper where people from the same group or from a very different group were reviewing particular books. And I was really noticing that throughout, but it was true even here. And I'm curious why books by women are seem so frequently, not just in this issue, to be reviewed only by women.
oh, but you're trying to get flames to come out of my horns, right? Because you're not actually curious why that is. Everybody in the world knows why that is. You know why that is.
So tell me why you think it is, because I'm not sure we would agree.
Because the paper would be burned to the ground and the homes of every editor would be stoned if a man reviewed a woman's book. When is the
I
last time in the New York Times Book Review that you've ever seen a man review a book written by a woman?
Well, there's one in this issue. So, but yeah, I don't actually think that's true. I think it's only if a man gave a really stupid review to a book by a woman, which I don't think is all that unlikely,
Okay,
honestly.
but in 2023, how do we know that the writing public that tweets about these things, which is I guess what the Times is terrified of, wouldn't call a negative review a stupid review? I don't know. It's all this political stuff, which I'm a lot more into than you are. I don't. It makes me deeply distrust the groundwater here of the kinds of conversations that are going on. I just there are all sorts of invisible lines now that simply cannot be crossed, and that I know this in firsthand experience because I've had to fight to cross them.
I can imagine it would be a pretty scary thing to put out stuff like this. I mean, it can be scary enough to decide to talk about something on a booktube channel, but to put it
Yeah,
in the New York Times,
because
you
of the
might not want
nature
to
of
risk
social
much.
media, the reviewer who steps over the line is personally vulnerable. What if an older white male reviewer really wants to review a book on race relations issue in the United States? And his editor is of course going to say, well, we like you, but you're the wrong reviewer for this book. And what if he says, I know you want someone who's black or Asian or whatever the book is about to review this, but I feel passionately I would really like to do it. Even if that editor says, yes, he is still in danger of being canceled or having a brick thrown through his window or whatever. It's,
I suppose
I
it depends on what his reasons for being passionate about the issue are.
well, yeah, that's kind of what I mean. If he's passionate because he wants to condemn the book, then
Right.
he's doomed. Not only will he never work at the Times again, he'll never work anywhere else again. Even if the book deserves doom, even if the book deserves condemnation.
But a book, but if a person who has reviewed and studied those kinds of issues before were to condemn the book, it would be so much more powerful than if an ideologue who just wanted to condemn the issue
Right,
condemns the book. Then you condemn the review, or at least I would. If
right.
someone that I feel isn't actually responding to the book but to the topic,
It's just
I'm not going to take it seriously if they condemn the book.
I wonder if a legitimately credentialed expert on the field would get the review from an editor despite those credentials. I
Yeah.
I wonder if other and what I mean to say is I wonder if other elements aren't involved now that we all have to think about now whenever we read a book review. I had to go through this with the Boston Globe uh, or the Christian Science Monitor about How the Word is Passed by Clint Smith. I was originally told, we definitely want to cover this book, but you're not the right reviewer. And I persisted, and my review had criticism in it. There are places in the book where it's a wonderful book, and Clint Smith is a fantastic writer, and there were a couple of places in the book where he is simply being falsely unfair to the people he's interviewing, to the subject matter. In any other book on any other subject, you would expect a reviewer to call that out, while still generally approving of the book. But those parts got watered down in the edit process, which never happened.
Yeah.
Would never have happened for a book about the French Revolution, for instance. I just anyway, we got off on a touchy political subject right away. How did we do
Well,
that?
actually, I was going to say that to a degree, I'm not sure that that idea of choosing someone who is a specialist or knows anything about a particular subject is a big thing at the New York Times Book Review. That's not how they assign reviews.
Oh,
They're not choosing, scholars for the nonfiction book reviews in the same way that I think we might see in the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books, where we're seeing specialists review as opposed to
okay.
most of the nonfiction here is reviewed by people who are maybe interested in the topic in some way, but not
Or connected to it in some
or
gimmick.
connected or have written an opposing book or whatever, but
I think the Times
not
editors,
another
I think the
specialist.
did to gimmick assignments.
Mm-hmm.
Biggest criticism of them is what they call a get. I hate that. Absolutely hate it. It makes a flea circus out of our profession. It makes it into something that, well, I don't care about the review or the book. I just care about the matchup. And I honestly get the impression, I think this was very endemic to Pamela Paul.
Hmm.
I get the impression that a lot of times in a lot of reviews, I get the impression that that's all the matchup is all that the editors cared about either. That's just it happens a couple of times in this issue. Uh,
Well, actually, the cover um, is by Caleb Crane, and he's a novelist. He's a beautiful writer. He's a great thinker, but he's also a novelist rather than a reviewer. And I think that's it's extraordinarily common for the review. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with it necessarily.
Not necessarily, no. And in this case, no,
Right.
because
Right.
Caleb Crane is also an omnivorous reader, an endless
Yes.
reader. And there's no way to, you only have to watch an interview or know him, right? You only have to watch an interview to know that that's true. You can't bar a legitimate, ardent reader from writing a book review. What would make it illegitimate is my frequent complaint, which is if they are a direct competitor in some way to the book they're reviewing. And Caleb Crane hasn't written a novel in a long time. And the book that he's reviewing is a COVID book. So
Yes.
there's
It's a
no
very different,
possibility.
right. It's not a competitor. And
There's no right.
right.
There's no overlap at
Absolutely.
all.
Absolutely.
He's writing about the kind of novel that he likes and is telling you about it.
Yes.
It doesn't even raise the specter of suspicion. But
Right.
I want to ask more stat questions before we dig in to the issue. Like for instance, I have two more stats that I want to ask you about. One of mine is of the books listed covered in the book review. How many have I read? I've read 5.
Ah,
It's very small for such a long list. Did you keep a stat? Have you read any of them?
I haven't read any of them. I have a couple of them on my Kindle that publishers have sent,
Okay,
but
so
I haven't read them.
the other stat
Um,
that I had was, what about reading the book review and having a review have that effect of, ooh, I want to read that.
right.
I had one of those. The Parole, Prison, and the Possibility of Change by Ben Austen.
And that's one that I never would have thought, oh, I want to read that book, but
No,
the review is
the
fabulous.
review was incredibly
It's
good. Yes,
interesting
and
and
it gives the lie a little to my Grandpa Simpson rant earlier because the review is definitely a get. It's written by a prisoner, by an
yeah,
inmate.
yeah. But
You
it is
have to figure.
so, I
And he
mean,
was wonderful.
it's
His review
clearly
was
someone who's
wonderful.
committed to this issue and interested in this issue and widely read in this
Widely
issue.
read, but also just generally eloquent. It wasn't that
Yes,
they clearly
beautifully
didn't take
argued.
him just because he knew how things work. They,
Hmm.
I mean, in other words,
And he's a New Yorker writer. Is it New Yorker? I forgot what it is. He writes regularly for somewhere
he writes regularly
else.
for publication, even though he is still
Beautiful writer.
incarcerated.
Yeah, right.
When I was reading it, I was the point that I was trying to make is no, it's not only that he has insider information. When I was reading that review, I was thinking, I'd have gladly read you on the book that Caleb Klein reviewed.
Yeah, yeah,
You're just a
absolutely.
really good observant reader. That's I would take that anyway. So there's an example of a New York Times showboating get that I didn't disagree
Right.
with. Go figure. There's no living with me. Are you gonna show people your mug? I got a chuckle out of it. They should do. Just in case any of you were wondering whether or not Hannah was an Uber nerd only on camera, I can attest to the fact that she's an Uber nerd all the time.
Please excuse me for drinking throughout, but I'm having seasonal allergies still, and my throat is all scratchy and weird, and it helps my voice a bit.
So what else stood out for you? Should we go through review by review?
Actually, I wanted to give one more stat. There are two, well, the background here is that coming up in December, in honor of Willa Cather's 150th birthday, I'm going to be reading a bunch of her novels as well as reviewing a new biography of her. And I've read some other biographies, etc., of her. And I'm looking forward to those discussions in December. But this review has two allusions, one explicit to Willa Cather. And that's not something that I normally notice in the book review.
So, but okay, you don't normally notice allusions to Willa Cather in the book review,
Correct.
but do you notice this kind of thing? Like when you're reading through the book review, will you notice that a note has been struck a couple of times?
Yes.
An allusion to, oh, what's the matter, baby?
I'm
Oh,
always fascinated by that. I didn't realize that for years. For years, I've not read the book review cover to cover. I've read the sections that I was particularly interested in. And only in the last few years have I read a little more consistently all the way through. And I'm always blown away by how many echoes there are throughout, or even reviews that are placed right next to each other that on their face don't necessarily seem to have anything in common, but then there'll be some through line or some reference or some comparison that is directly connected, which I find fascinating.
okay, but would anybody else see that?
Um,
I want to know how prone you are to this kind of thing.
well, I think that Willa Cather, the people would notice the one where she was mentioned, but the other one, I'm not sure if they would, if they weren't thinking about her specifically. I think unless people are reading it cover to cover, I think some of the themes wouldn't come out. But if they are, I think they might. And
Well,
I think they must be planned, although I will admit that I have a tendency to see links between whatever I put next to each other.
that's what I was asking. Like, and also some of those links, some of the things that you, even if you don't have a tendency to see it, surely some of those links will be more readily to hand the more a person has read. So
Possibly.
I mean, Willa Cather might be mentioned in one review, and then two reviews later, a location that's central to Willa Cather might be mentioned, and your brain would make that connection, but
Right.
a reader might not.
I
Um,
guess that's possible. Yeah. Well, I was thinking, I mean, this one is a little more obvious, and I suppose only reviewers would think about it. There is a review of what seems to me a very strange book about eyeliner as a cultural history.
yes.
Um, and it's right next to the parole um, prison and possibility of change review. And both of them began with very personal anecdotes. And both anecdotes um, make sense in the review. They don't feel like it's this incredibly personal thing as much as they do a sort of quick, easy way into a review in some ways. The one for the parole, I think, comes back at the end and has some meaning. And the first one is just a snappy little story. And I'm curious because I never put myself in reviews ever when I write. Um, do you ever? And do you think it works in these?
Every once in a while, every once in a great while, uh, I'm my own case is a little bit odd because well, it, I'm I write all kinds of bookish stuff, columns and whatnot. So, and some of them, sometimes you can put yourself in there legitimately. Otherwise, I just don't feel that it has a place, even if there's a personal side to it. I'd rather go after the statements in the book based on that knowledge and just lay it out for the reader. The reader doesn't know me. So, I mean, there are
Right.
times where I'm really tempted. Like if I were to write a review of a book about dog training, I'd be really tempted to insert myself to say, well, according to me. Doesn't that does that make you distrust a review when somebody does that?
It doesn't necessarily make me distrust them, but I do see it as so informal. And for me, that's the huge difference between the written book reviews that I do and what I do on BookTube. On BookTube, I don't review books. I talk about what I love in books, why I love it, how it connects to me, what memories it brings up, stuff like that. That it's the personal is the heart of what I talk about in BookTube, as opposed to when I'm trying to be. If I talk, to be honest, I feel like when I'm writing, if I were to frame it within a personal story, that I would start giving my, I was going to say my personal opinions, and it's not that I'm not giving my opinions, I am, but I'm trying to think more abstractly about what is good and bad in a book, what works in a book, rather than just what do I love in a book or what do I find um, harder or whatever.
So do
So,
you
so I don't think I just trust other people, but um, but it does seem extraneous. It seems unnecessary in a book review. In a book review, I don't want to know about the person. On BookTube, for whatever reasons, I do want to know about the
well,
people
you've
who
got
are
the
talking
person's
about
face right
books.
there. You've got the person's
Yes,
directly talking to you. That might be the reason.
right. Yeah.
Although, so you're saying that you generally don't, but the two cases where it happened, it didn't decrease your trust.
No, and maybe it's because these don't actually feel personal. I mean, they do, but it's not um emotionally, this is how I feel as much as, here's the snappy story, or here's the story that meant this is real, which the eyeliner one is a snappy story, and the parole one is the setting it in the story about walking with another man who is up for parole, and so
Yeah.
making it feel very immediate and
Yeah, it's
real.
very in the parole story, the parole review, it's very subdued. And it has a lot
Yes.
more power for that. You're like two-thirds of the way into the review when the reviewer says that he's complimenting the writer of the book by saying he knows all about our world.
Mm-hmm. Well, he actually says it in the
Like a
first,
freight
but
train.
I missed it. I went back and read it. He says, I was walking with a fellow inmate.
Yeah.
And somehow I was thinking, oh, this is somebody who's walking with an inmate and not really absorbing that fellow inmate.
So you're saying that the jury's out. Sometimes a snappy personal anecdote won't put you off from a
Yeah.
review. Do you have any actual hardline pet peeves when it comes to book reviews in the New York Times?
In the
I
New
know
York
it's going to
Times.
shock you, but I do.
Well, why don't you tell me and I'll think about
I
that
have
as you.
I have two huge pet peeves when it comes to the Times. One is the one I've already mentioned, where they will get someone who is a direct financial competitor to the book under review to review it. There is no way that that can work. One person who has written for the Times used to complain to me, used to defend that practice by saying, "Well, not if I praise the book. I mean, you can't call me biased if I praise it. There is no way for that to work. If you bash the book, you are bashing a competitor. If you praise the book, you are hoping that a rising tide will float all boats. And there is a glaring example of that in this issue of the review, in the fiction section. Claire Vane Watkins reviews Death Valley by Melissa Broder. Melissa Broder's Death Valley is a dysfunctional family trauma that takes place, especially at its climax, in the grueling conditions of the Mojave Desert. Claire Vane Watkins' last novel, which is out this year, is a grueling family drama that climaxes in the Mojave Desert. It's the same book, Change the character names, it's the same book. Change the character names and a few of the over-the-counter medical problems, and it's the same book. She praises this book, calls it dark and brooding, and in that final paragraph, she is clearly writing not a review of Melissa Broder's book, but the kind of review she wishes she got. It's thoroughly, thoroughly untrustworthy. There's no way to.
I didn't know who she was, Claire Watkins.
They wrote the
So
exact same book. They didn't write a variation on the theme. They wrote the exact same book. That is just
which makes me question this. I mean, I was questioning it already. Was like, it's so over the top.
it is.
It's just I mean, I ought to read.
That the concluding paragraph is ridiculous. It would fit with Anna Karenina.
Yeah, Death Valley is a triumph, a ribald prayer for sensuality and grace in the face of profound loss, a hilarious revolt against the aggressive godlessness, dehumanization, and fear plaguing our time. All 10 of Melissa Broder's finger lamps are blazing. Why not be totally changed into fire? And I thought, this is so over the top that it sounded like it was satire almost, and I was wondering what was up, but the idea that she has kind of a mixed relation to this other than just loving it. It was, I mean,
and I'll add a little spoiler for our viewers. Both books are terrible.
I haven't read either, and then now I will just keep it that way.
No characters, transcribed social media, no ending, no climax, no arc, no nothing. Just both of them are. They go to the Mojave Desert, and you're desperately hoping that all the characters, and maybe the author and her agent, are all going to die there. That's one pet peeve. And then my other pet
This
peeve,
was also the review that mentioned Willa Cather by name.
my other pet peeve is not exclusive to the book review, but it is now synonymous with the New York Times, and that is whataboutism. That is where you take a story where you are not as a journalist, where you as a person are supposed to have a completely solid footing on where you stand, and instead what we're going to do is we'll just report it. We're just going to report it like we were aliens from the planets in Alpha Centauri. And that's bad enough when it's the comparative merits of the Democratic and Republican frontrunner in a presidential election. But when it directly has to do with the matter of literature, what do you make of that essay at the back of this thing about censoring books?
I found that quite thoughtful. I did.
Well, it might have been thoughtful, but it doesn't come down on either side of the issue. It absolutely
right.
has to.
It's certainly not
the New York Times
it
book
does
review.
not, but a book review doesn't have, I mean, a thought piece does not have to come down on a total conclusion. Although I think the conclusion is pretty clear here, and it's that Mary Bly is good. She was the editor. I think she's a Shakespeare scholar, actually. But she was writing the review, I mean the intro and the conclusion, talking about the changes that they were making. And she puts her foot down and says she won't do it if they won't talk explicitly, if they just take these out and hide the changes that are made, that's wrong, but that in this case the edits are not necessarily wrong.
They
So
aren't edits.
maybe you should set the
They aren't edits. They weren't done with their authors. You can only do edits with an author. They weren't edits. They're censorship.
I'm going to give you my piece in a minute, but could you summarize just vaguely what it is about?
The essay at the back is covering a familiar territory here on BookTube. We've discussed it. Many channels have discussed it, where publishers are going to the back catalogs of dead authors who were racially insensitive or insensitive in some other way, and cleaning up or changing that language. They say in order to ensure the wonder of these books for a new generation. The cynics say in order to maintain the financial viability of their backstock. So Georgette Hare and all the other examples that have come to mind, Roald Dahl has come to mind, P.G. Wodehouse has come to mind, and plenty of others, where people are going in and finding where the language is so-called wrong and changing it, smoothing it out, so that a new reader will find it and find nothing objectionable. And this piece gives you major cases gives you quotes from people who are in the industry. One brave little isolated quote from someone saying, I don't want you to do this at all. And then a
Is
whole
it
bunch
only
of
what?
quotes from people in the industry saying, well, I'll only agree to it if it's done correctly. There's no way to correctly censor.
Right.
Whether you're a Shakespeare scholar or not, she shouldn't have taken the job. And would go to court in a nanosecond if someone tried to do that to her work. Just just well, really, I know you know where I stand now. That drove me nuts. The New
And
York
I,
Times Book Review would not condemn this.
I don't, I think that the voice against doing this at all is a little stronger than what you're saying, or that's how I read it, at least that the idea that this was clear censorship doesn't seem like what it's saying. It's saying she wrote in a way that was completely acceptable, that she did not mean this as a negative comment, as racist comments, um, anti-Semitic comments. She did not intend them that way. She wasn't thinking of them that way. If she were writing now, she absolutely would not write these things. We know that, someone who wanted an audience would never publish something saying the kind of stuff she wrote. It was not her intention. Where it's censorship, if someone intends something and would intend it now and you change it, absolutely, no question. In this case, she's using stuff that was acceptable then that's not acceptable to the people who are writing, um, and not today. And these are books that are read by people who, it's not like they're studied. So, saying you're going to change 1984 or change, I don't know, name some book that has some
Shakespeare,
kind of, hmm?
Shakespeare.
Shakespeare. Yeah. I mean, those are studied. Yes, people enjoy them, but they're also read quite seriously. And these are books that are read for fun, and they're read by people who are not reading them closely, who are going to be really bothered by them. And if Hire was alive now, she would not want these in her books. These were not her points. And so the argument, I'm not saying you should agree with it, but that the argument that it might be okay here is a little different from how what it means in some other stuff. It's these books are often read by young people too, as opposed to, books who are read by older people who are able to think a little more critically about cultural context. Um, the idea of just saying there are a bunch of lines, there's the any censorship, or the, well, censorship with full acknowledgement of why, what changes were made and why, um, seems really different. And this article doesn't really take a stand, but it lays out how a variety of people feel about it. And I think that that's kind of a thoughtful um, discussion.
Well,
Yeah.
naturally, I take issue with the characterization of the subject that gives the only possible get out of jail free card to academia.
Mm.
Actually, I
Well,
object to an
as
overview of the
as you
situation.
know, I'm going to stand up for
Yes,
for
an overview of the situation that says normal people won't be able to handle this, but we in academia can. It's
oh,
naturally.
I don't think she's saying that,
No, you were
though.
saying
Is
that.
she?
You were saying if these works are studied, they're free. Then they're exempt from censorship. But if
Oh,
they're not
not
studied,
they
then
don't have
no.
to be studied in academia. I mean, they can be studied in high school. They can be just read critically, which I think those of us who read classics, when we go pick up a book of classics, we're thinking about the cultural context a bit, as opposed to, when we pick up something 21st century where, yeah, well, those books are going to be thought of in their cultural contexts sometime in the future, but we might not say, oh, yes, they have the right to say, not the right, but they're saying this because they're from a particular time or whatever. That, um, we.
In Melissa Broder's fiction, all black men are faithful churchgoers and all white men are stupid. Is that gigantically different from reading an old John O'Hara story in which a Japanese person is called a Jap? Is that gigantically different? I don't see that it is. I think if a young kid that we're trying to bend over backwards to protect here, if they opened one of those John O'Hara short stories and found the word Jap, they'd be more repelled than their adults would be. They don't need protecting. It's, I
I think
think.
they'd be more repelled. What I think is that they wouldn't say, "Oh, yes, this is horrible," but the person who wrote it didn't intend it to be a slur.
If
They were saying it because it was a generally
it was a
acceptable
general
thing,
thing,
as
it was
opposed to something that is such a slur and out of the general. That if someone uses that kind of language now, it has a very different meaning.
but
Um,
language
Not
changes.
that it wasn't racist then, but it was just part of the cultural milieu. It wasn't explicitly meant as something evil.
Right. But if you look at this issue and you say, well, for the authors that just were using the language that was in the air, but they weren't voicing their own prejudices, they were just
Oh,
using
they were voicing their own prejudices. They just weren't voicing it as intended to be cruel.
okay,
That doesn't mean it wasn't. It just means
right.
they didn't intend it
It
to
seems to
be.
me that the minute you draw that distinction, you open the door to remove not only Shakespeare from the curricula in 10 years, but Huck Finn from the curricula today. And I don't want those things removed from the
Well,
curricula.
Huck Finn pretty much has been.
Yeah.
I mean, not from college, but students used to read that in high school. Not that it's necessarily the best book for high school students, I guess. It's a pretty complicated book. But yeah, I can't imagine teaching something like that now to a ninth grade class or whatever. It's just not going to happen.
No, it's not going to happen. I can't imagine being allowed to teach it. I can definitely imagine
Right.
what a class discussion it would be. Oh my God, you couldn't ask for better.
Yes.
You
Yes.
couldn't ask for better. Because not only would the subject come up, but it would come up in a book that, despite all of their best intentions, is in fact entertaining them.
Yes.
Oh my
Yeah.
God, that combination comes around once in a blue moon. I would kill to teach it.
Oh, I'm really looking forward to Percival Everett's rewriting and seeing what he does because he's such a brilliant writer. And that's going to be, I hope, bringing Huckleberry Finn back into the conversation rather than just dismissing it. Which it
Before we run out of time, are we saying that you had no Hannah pet peeves when it came to the Times? Oh, what about the other category? My category of a review that really made you want to read the book. Were there quite a few of those, or any?
there were fewer in this book, in this issue, that made me want to read the book. I'm really looking forward to reading Day, Michael Cunningham's book. Although the review, while I thought the review was great and it was raised interesting issues of its own that I don't think were necessarily as connected to the book as I would have thought of without having read the review, at least. Um, the review didn't especially make me want to read it, but I really want to read it.
The review didn't especially review the book.